So part of my daily routine includes an afternoon walk. This is something that's been providing a lot of just care to my soul, that I just consistently get out and get this walk. And I've told you about this walk before. I've mentioned interesting things that I've seen on my walks. I've talked about turkeys on roofs that I've seen. I've talked about Halloween horrors that I've seen out on my walks. Oh, the things I see, right? But this week, I was walking into the neighborhood and actually saw something a lot less unusual, something that you might hope to see on a walk, but it was nonetheless worthy of my interest and attention. Because as I was walking, I saw a beautiful pot of flowers along the side of a neighbor's yard, and I had to stop and take a closer look at the blooms. One of the things that Lauren and I did for fun and just for relaxation when we were in Dallas is that we would go to the Dallas Arboretum, which is a beautiful botanical garden there. And I would always love to watch my wife as she would stop and kind of investigate every flower in a row and look right into them and smell them. And I've tried to do that myself. So when I saw this pot, I thought, I'm going to stop. I'm going to look at this flower. And I'm not a flower expert, so I would have to ask, John Little, our resident flower expert, about what these flowers actually were. I couldn't tell you what they were. But they had an elegant beauty to them that I found enjoyable. And as I examined them, I noticed that in fact they were not fully bloomed. They were kind of somewhere in between bulb and full bloom. But they were starting to open up and reveal more of their beauty and splendor, but of course they weren't all the way there. It could have been something to do with the cold, I'm not sure. But it got me thinking about how many of the most beautiful and true and good things in life are experienced through a process of gradual revelation. The most beautiful, the most true, the most good things in life are experienced through a process of gradual revelation. And we do occasionally have an epiphany. I've had a few in my life, a moment of striking clarity that seems to come like a bolt from the blue. But more often, we come to know things through this progressive revelation over time. What's good and beautiful and true takes time to come into focus, just like this flower that I was looking at was going to take its time to come into bloom. And each of us has experienced this in some way or another. If you've had kids, you have watched them grow up over the years and reveal more and more of who they are, right? If you have a close friend or a relative, you have experienced the way in which you know more and more about them as the years stack up, and it reveals more and more about them over time, and that relationship becomes more interesting. You wouldn't sense that you didn't know them 5 years ago, but you know them so much more now. You've lived more life with them. We find in these next few scenes in Mark a continuation of the progressive revelation of Jesus' identity and power. This is a flower we know, but it's a flower that's still blooming. We're seeing more of his identity and power, which had reached a whole new level of clarity last week. Remember, with the storm and the demoniac? Last week we saw how Jesus revealed that he was not just a miracle worker, but someone who was able to demonstrate mastery over both nature and supernature, which are two sources of anxiety and fear in human life. In Mark 5:21 to 6:6, we're seeing the revelation blossom even further as Jesus reveals that he is also master over two sources of human anxiety and fear, two more, and they are debilitating sickness and then even death. And yet the theme of personal faith is raised to new heights of importance as well. We're going to see some old themes in this passage, but articulated in new and interesting ways. So as we step into the text this morning, we'll pay attention to the blooming dimensions of Jesus' identity. But more so, we will zoom in on the role of faith in these particular scenes. First, we will examine the bold reach of faith. The bold reach of faith. And then we will examine the blind rejection of faithlessness. The blind rejection of faithlessness. And then finally, we're going to consider together what it means for us to focus our faith. To focus our faith. And as we do, I'll read Mark 5:21 all the way to 6:6. And we're in the English Standard Version. Verse 21. And when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered about him, and he was beside the sea. Then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and seeing him, he fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, so that she may be made well and live. And he went with him. And a great crowd followed him and thronged about him. And there was a woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years, and who had suffered much under many physicians, and had spent all that she had, and was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard the reports about Jesus, and came up behind him in the crowd, and touched his garment. For she said, If I touch even his garments, I will be made well. And immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. And Jesus, perceiving in himself the power that had gone out from him, immediately turned about in the crowd and said, Who touched my garments? And his disciples said to him, You see the crowd pressing around you, and yet you say, Who touched me? And he looked around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease. While he was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house some who said, Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further? But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, Do not fear, only believe. And he allowed no one to follow him except Peter and James and John, the brother of James. They came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, and Jesus saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. And when he entered, he said to them, Why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but sleeping. And they laughed at him. But he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him, and went in where the child was. Taking her by the hand, he said to her, Talitha kumai, which means, Little girl, I say to you, arise. And immediately the girl got up and began walking, for she was 12 years of age. And they were immediately overcome with amazement. And he strictly charged them that no one should know this, and told them to give her something to eat. He went away from there and came to his hometown, and his disciples followed him. And on the Sabbath he began to teach in the synagogue, and many who heard him were astonished, saying, Where did this man get these things? What is this wisdom given to him? How are such mighty works done by his hands? Is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary, and brother of James, and Joseph, and Judas, and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us? And they took offense at him. And Jesus said to them, A prophet is not without honor, except in his hometown, and among his relatives, and his own household. And he could do no mighty work there, except that he laid his hands on a few sick people and healed them. And he marveled because of their unbelief. And he went about the villages teaching. Wow. Isn't this a dramatic story? I just can't help but be shaped by the drama of what we've just read. Mark is again putting his incredible storytelling skills on display. And by now, we can actually easily recognize that familiar sandwich structure that Mark occasionally uses in relaying events to us. We see such a structure on display again here as we see really a scene within a scene that's nested within a larger scene. Almost like Russian nesting dolls, one inside another, right? The broader story of the sandwich, which is the bread above and below, the meat of the sandwich, is that of Jairus' interaction with Jesus. The scene opens with Jairus and then closes with his affairs again. The meat within the sandwich of that broader scene is the exchange that Jesus has with the woman who is bleeding. As we know by now, this sandwich structure helps us to see these stories as interrelated. It's not an accident that they're put together like this. They are not considered independently, but are actually best taken as part of one unit of interpretation. So, what do these stories have in common, right? What interpretive work are they centered upon? What are we supposed to see? Both Jairus and the woman with the issue of blood demonstrate for us something in common: the bold reach of faith. Let's take a look at each of them to see what's different, what's the same, and what we can take away. First of all, let's look at Jairus. We see that Jairus is the ruler of this synagogue, or of the local synagogue. Now, this means that he was likely an elder in the synagogue, and he was one who had a degree of authority to oversee the operations of the religious functions day to day, and he was also someone who could settle disputes. This was somebody who, if there was an issue in the congregation, one of his primary tasks was to essentially rule on, righteousness, matters of public righteousness one way or the other. So he was somebody of great repute and somebody whose word carried great weight in that society. Some scholars point out that the language indicates that Jairus was probably not the chief elder. He was not the Don Johnson, let's say, of the church, but he was nonetheless one of the elders. He was a person of consequence in Jewish society, and he would have been very well known in this time. So it's safe to say that Jairus is a really high-class individual. It's a lot of social standing. He's the kind of person that other people looked up to, that you would tell your son you wanted to be like. You would point to him and say, "Be like Jairus, model your life after him." He has tons of social power, and he has lots of formal religious power. And he's someone that others are looking to as a known pillar of their whole community. People were seeking him out. He was in demand. His calendar was full of places to be and people to meet with, right? And important decisions were going to be made through him. He may have even had connections to the local officials from Rome. There's a very good chance that he would have been a go-between between the local civic authorities and the religious structures. And yet, he comes on the scene, and what does he do? He falls at Jesus' feet in total deference. And have we seen this posture before? I think it's no accident that we've actually just seen somebody else fall on their feet, or fall from their feet down to their hands and knees before Jesus. Right? We've seen this very recently. The demoniac of recent memory did the same thing just a chapter ago. And then he's referred to by Jesus as the Son of God. He refers to Jesus as the Son of God, So this is a posture which recognizes the superior status of Jesus and from which an appeal is going to come. We know that Jairus has something on his mind, and he's not laying there in the dirt for no reason. He has an appeal to make. And in fact, what we're seeing here is that he who ruled others falls at the feet of the true ruler of the synagogue and of the whole world. This is the bold reach of Jairus' faith. Though he is typically high and lifted up, the bold reach of faith in his life requires a condescension, a dropping to the ground, a move of humility before Jesus. That's what the bold reach of faith looks like for somebody of his social standing. It's a movement down to someone who is a carpenter and a teacher, and yet so obviously his infinite superior. And what is Jairus' request? He requests that Jesus come to heal his daughter who is about to die. And Mark makes sure that we see the way in which he asks. It says, and he implored him earnestly, "Come, lay hands on her so that she may be made well and live." This is a confident and an earnest request. This is a request made from the heart of a man who understands not only the nature of his own authority, but also of Jesus' authority, and by extension, at least to a great degree, what Jesus can do. He understands what it means to be a person of decision, to be a person who can say something and it is done, a person of action and of power. And he recognizes that Jesus is such a person, and he can make his request confidently, expecting such a response. And what's on the line for Jairus? What's on the line? It's life and death for his daughter, for the person who represents him in the future, right? This is a terrible situation. The life or the death of his own child is on the line. So he has to believe. He has to believe. There's no emotional space for him to do anything else. He must believe. Can this one that he has heard of save even his own daughter from her life-threatening situation? Can he do it? Jairus might be wondering in his heart. But Jairus has to believe that Jesus can. And he comes confidently requesting, imploring Jesus, assuming that Jesus has what it will take, and also that Jesus cares enough to do it. Jesus sees this attitude and calls it faith. Calls it faith. And he went with him. As I read about this exchange, I can't help but think of Abraham in the Old Testament, for whom his faith was also counted as righteousness. Jesus responds to Jairus and just goes with him. The text doesn't elaborate very much. This is not a coincidence, but in fact the obvious consequence of such faith. But Mark makes sure that we know that it wasn't so easy. There was a complication. And there's always complications, aren't there? Okay, I've got Jesus on my side. He's coming with me. He's got the power. He cares. Off we go. But something happens. And doesn't that ring true to life experience? As soon as I said there was a complication, I saw 4 heads start doing this, right? There was complications, even in God's presence in our life. Even God's faithfulness never seems to come on time sometimes, or exactly in the way that I want it to come. And Jairus begins to panic, as any parent would. But before we can think too much about how that feels for Jairus, it's interesting, Mark shifts our gaze. He starts to let you panic along with Jairus, and then immediately forces you to look at something else without addressing the issue. Verse 25 to 34 introduce us to a woman who is also desperate for Jesus' help and care. And she has come to him with no less faith than Jairus, though it looks radically different from her vantage point. What's different? While Jairus is high class with lots of social power, this woman is on the other end of that social scale. She is sick, but she is not just any kind of ill. Like the leper before her, she is in a state of perpetual ritual uncleanness because of a continuing menstrual bleed. Leviticus 15:19 through 33 goes into great detail about how such regular bodily functions temporarily would make a person unclean. However, this poor woman was caught in the midst of those regulations and never stopped bleeding, and so she was always unclean. It's a nightmare situation. Furthermore, she was also bankrupt. She had spent everything that she had on cures, and how could you do anything but try to cure it? But nothing and no one had been able to help her. Here is a poor woman, destitute, unclean, and without anyone to help her in the whole cold world. I think of that old lyric, there ain't no love in the heart of the city. This woman is in the boot of the world. It's standing on her. She's stuck, caught between forces bigger than herself, needing a savior, needing someone to help her. She was stuck and always unclean. And again, I notice something really interesting about her. She says in her heart, if I touch even his garments, I will be made well. It's that same faith that Jairus has, that same confident reach, that bold reach of faith. Notice what she has in common with Jairus. She's dealing with an issue of illness, though not unto death. She is in need of Jesus, and like Jairus, she is willing to make the bold reach of faith. And for her, that the reach of that is the reach is that of a small, fainting hope. It's really a last hope that reaches upward from her low status to the hem of Jesus' garment. This would have been incredibly socially risky for her to do. Jesus is a religious leader. She's unclean. She's going to consciously defile him, essentially, in an effort to help herself. This would not have reflected well on her if it had gone wrong. And in fact, she's meek and lowly, and she even tries to hide herself as she reaches for him. You can imagine her sort of sneaking through the crowd. But she touches the robe, and he stops. Who touched my garments? The disciples, of course, are confused, which seems to be their role. And they ask him what he means. What do you mean, who touched you? We're in a crowd. This is a mob. And Jesus ignores them, as becomes humorous at this point in the story. He just doesn't even respond to them, but he looks for her. He starts scanning the crowd. Verse 33 says, but the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. We get the impression that she feels she has something to confess, that she has wronged him. Because she was low social status and unclean and poor, she thought she might have to steal her blessing. She thought she had to steal it. But she comes forward anyway to explain. And how does Jesus treat her? He says to her, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease. Jesus' words to this woman come like a drink of pure, living water. No condemnation, only release, only redemption, only security, and only love. The weak and the lowly people of the world, those without power or privilege, can come to Jesus for help and be received. And not begrudgingly, but with warmth and with verve and with care. Jesus puts everyone else on hold to care for this precious woman in just the way this woman needs. Her sickness has been healed already, but now he wants her to say aloud for the crowd to see just what her faith has led her to do. That's what's important to Jesus. He hopes to use her as an example of faith and its reward. We see then in Jairus, from his high position and from the woman in her low position, that faith precedes blessing. Faith precedes blessing. But what of Jairus' daughter? Has the complication of this woman cost too much? The servants actually say that she has died. So it seems maybe that the mistake was made of some kind. One life was chosen over another. How do we feel about this in this moment? Jairus might be wondering how to feel. Yet Jesus comforts Jairus. He says to him, do not fear, only believe. Jesus then rebukes the mourners as he walks up to the house, right? We'll talk a little bit more about who these mourners were in a minute. And he also takes 3 disciples and the parents of the dead girl into the house. Verse 41 and 42 show the tender care and power of Jesus over death itself as he says to this little girl, I say to you, arise. And of course, she does. And everyone is overcome with amazement. And then Jesus charges them again to secrecy. Why? Why does he keep doing this? This is one of the things that's interesting about Mark's gospel, is Jesus will do something and then say, keep a lid on it. Don't tell anybody yet. Why is that there? I think it's interesting. We'll get into it later, but notice that. I'm always telling you to make note of when he does that. And then he also says, make sure she has something to eat. Why does he do that? I think one of the reasons he's doing that is because when someone is resurrected, just as when he ultimately is resurrected, eating food is a way of proving that in fact you're actually back to normal. You're not a phantom. You're not a ghost. It really is you. There's something true that's really happened. Make sure she eats. And we see then in these two juxtaposed scenes a portrait of Jesus as master over sickness and death. And he conquers both through displays of power and deep care. Deep care. This is the gentle giant Jesus that we have come to rely upon in our place of deepest pain and need. This is the Jesus who speaks calm into our panicked lives and peace into the raging seas of our unmet expectations and driving doubts and fears. This is the Jesus I come home to at night and say, you'll have to take it from here. We've seen in both Jairus and the poor woman that faith precedes blessing. Our own, and it's also an invitation for others to share in our faith and receive the blessing of God as well. Jesus wanted to make sure that others saw the bold reach of faith. The bold reach of faith becomes the channel of our blessing and of God's glory in the world. Though faith is not a work, as though it could earn the real value of God's grace, it is nonetheless the only heart posture that is fit to receive that same grace. One of my professors used to tell me that faith is not a work, but it is open hands. It's something that you have to put your hands out to receive the grace coming. It's not something that is a work in the sense that you could actually buy grace with it. It's not worth what the grace is worth, but it is a posture with which you can receive that infinite value of Jesus' blood. We've seen in this text the bold reach of faith modeled by Jairus and the poor woman. So now let's look at its opposite, which is the blind rejection of faithlessness. We see this in 5:35 through 39, and also in chapter 6, verse 1 through 6. First of all, let's look at the mourners again at the house of the dead girl. In verse 38 to 40, we see that there is a commotion outside this home. Why? Why is there a commotion? Well, in this culture, there were actually professional mourners who would arrive when someone died. These people came essentially to begin the ritual process of lament for the dead. And these were not simply saddened relatives or friends, right? One Bible scholar writes, the lamentations consisted of choral song and antiphony, accompanied by hand clapping, right? So it was a very specific, big, gaudy thing that had to be done when somebody died. It was not really taken as sincere, but as ritual. And since Jairus occupied a prominent position in the Jewish community, the number of professional mourners would have been pretty large. That's why there's such a commotion. So along with the members of his family, they were making an uproar. And Jesus says to these mourners, why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but sleeping. And then the text says that, look what they do. They laugh at him. They laugh at him. They mock him. They think, you're crazy. These mourners have never heard of such a thing. Jesus must be out of his mind. Surely he's crazy. Have we heard that before in this narrative? Has anybody else ever thought that he was crazy? I think we're seeing patterns start to develop. I'm referring obviously to his family, who said he's lost his mind. We have to come and get him. We see in these mourners another picture of the insincere mockery of outsiders. These mourners react to Jesus' claims with mocking laughter, and they do not for a moment believe that Jesus is anything but mistaken. And how does Jesus respond? he puts them out of the house and takes only the child's parents and the disciples in to witness the miracle. These mourners do not get to see the glory of God because they are mockers. Their hearts are far from able to receive such a grace anyway. Jesus does not feel the need to prove them wrong. He has no chip on his shoulder, but he only lets them live on in their faithlessness. He allows them to continue. I'm reminded of the words from chapter 4 in the parable of the lamp, right? For to the one who has, more will be given. And from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. Jesus says this about the nature of faith. Notice that it's Jairus and the disciples that get more. It's the mourners who lose even what they have. We see the blind rejection of faithlessness in its full form right here. These mourners will literally be removed from the room for the miracle. They have forfeited their chance to see by their own faithlessness. And the next scene is really no less tragic. In fact, I think it's even more tragic. In chapter 6, verse 1 through 6, we see Jesus has gone away and come to his hometown of Nazareth. This is where he's from. This is where little Jesus was running around. And as usual, he begins to teach in the synagogue as he did in all the other towns. Think of the great exorcisms that he's performed at this point. Think of all the miracles that he has done. Think of who he is publicly, the cleansings. And now he has even raised the dead. I can imagine the longing within Jesus' heart to bring blessing upon his hometown, to come home and to bring home the goods, right? I understand that. I can imagine that longing that he has. To come to Nazareth, a backwater place from flyover country where no one ever expected anything good to happen. That's what Nazareth meant in those days. But what happens? Those in his hometown reject him. He's only one of us, isn't he? Who does he really think he is? We see in these Nazarenes a deep provincial pride. The text even says that they took offense at him. And that old phrase comes to mind, familiarity breeds contempt. These people have seen Jesus before, they know his family, and they don't like these fancy ideas that Jesus seems to have about himself. They don't see it, and they don't want to. They take offense at him, and Jesus said to them, "A prophet is not without honor, except in his hometown, and among his relatives, and his own household." And he could do no mighty work there, except that he laid his hands on a few sick people and healed them, by the way, which you should notice is pretty amazing, but they don't even see that. And he marvels because of their unbelief. And he went on among the villages teaching. The text says that he could do no mighty works there. And does this mean that he literally can't? No. It simply means to highlight the relationship between faith and blessing that we've already explored. He owes his grace to no one. Unbelief prevents the blessing that he would like to have imparted. But notice, he does actually do some miracles, as if that were a small thing. But we get the idea that he wanted to do so much more. It was in his heart to do more. But the blind rejection of faithlessness is a self-imposed blindness. So as fallen human beings, we are naturally haters of God and committed to our own wicked way of perceiving the world and all that is in it. Unbelief, we're meant to see here, is not morally neutral. It's not simply a clinical state of honest reflection, but it's part and parcel of an overall heart posture which has rejected God in the first place and therefore can't see him. We believe in order to see, and if we will not believe, we cannot see, Augustine ultimately said. So what are we to take from this part of the passage? How are we to understand the theological thrust of what Mark is saying to us between these contrasting visions? What are we, the disciples of Jesus, supposed to do? What's the thrust of the passage? I believe this passage is saying to us, as loud as possible, focus your faith. Focus your faith. We are to reject the faithlessness of the mourners and the Nazarenes, and we are to emulate Jairus and the poor woman in their bold reach of faith. I think we do this really in two related ways. Two related ways. Focus our faith, first of all, on Jesus' power rather than our panic. Focus our faith on Jesus' power rather than our panic. Think of the panic that would have been in Jairus' heart when he learned that his daughter was dying. It led him to place his full confidence upon Jesus' power, such that he gladly humbled himself before Jesus in a bold reach of faith, in a bold public display. Think of the woman who had spent all of her money and was no better. She had no hope but Jesus' power, and she focused her faith upon it with great expectation. If I can even touch the hem of his garment, I'll be made well. And though either could have given into panic, they zeroed in on Jesus' power. They chose to move toward Jesus as their solution rather than to remain in the panic of their problem. Second of all, focus your faith on Jesus' care rather than our circumstance. Focus your faith on Jesus' care rather than your circumstance. Again, think of Jairus' fears when the trip home with Jesus is met with those complications. You can almost hear Jairus wanting to say with the disciples, "Don't you care that she is perishing?" Just like those disciples said in that boat, "Don't you care that we are perishing, Jesus? Don't you see? Don't you involve yourself? Won't you help?" You can feel the complications and the panic of the circumstance. Or the woman with the issue of blood, wondering if she will have to steal her blessing. That's what she wonders. And we wonder if God cares. I've said this a few weeks ago. I want to say it again. I think it's so central to our life with Christ. It's a question that we have to keep asking and keep facing his goodness about. We sometimes wonder if God cares. But Jesus is so gentle and tender with both Jairus and with the woman. He makes sure that we know his power is matched only by his loving concern. He can be trusted. So just like a rose is in bloom, the glory and the majesty of Jesus takes time to flower in our hearts and in our minds. We've seen now something amazing. I'll finish with this comment. A couple chapters ago, Jesus calms a storm. He shows that he's master over nature and chaos. And nature is a real bit of anxiety-causing thing for us as human beings. It can be pretty scary. Jesus is the master of that. Then he conquers and shows that he's the master over the demonic realm, over satanic oppression. That's also a pretty legitimate source of anxiety for a human being. He's handled both of those. But two remain: sickness and death. Now he's dealt with those. So there's a stair step, an escalation, a flower in bloom to show both his goodness and his power across 2 chapters of Mark's gospel. We have now seen the full bloom of Jesus' mastery over nature and supernature, sickness and death. And furthermore, we have even considered the difference between the bold reach of faith and the blind rejection of faithlessness. And finally, we have resolved to focus our faith on Jesus' power and care so that we might experience his blessing. Pray. Father, we thank you for this time in your word today. I just pray that as we think on what we have heard today and as we walk towards you rather than away from you, that you would focus our faith on your goodness, on your power, on your care, and that we would extend our arm in the bold reach of faith to touch the hem of your garment, or that we would lower ourselves before you, the servant of all. We pray this in Jesus' name.